Thank you for joining us for the Kirby Institute seminar series. My name is Associate Professor David Heslop from the School of Population Health. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands in which we gather today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Today, we are presenting here from Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us here online today. So some housekeeping to start off with. The format of the seminar has changed to online for today due to the current weather conditions we're all experiencing. We'll start off with two presentations, one after the other, and I'll introduce both of our presenters firstly. Following this, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of both presentations. So please hold your questions until then. However, you can ask questions throughout, if you wish, by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, which will become available in the next few seconds. Okay, so I'd firstly like to introduce Damian Honeyman. Damian is an intensive care nurse at New South Wales Health and a PhD candidate at the Kirby Institute. He's also supervised by myself and Professor McIntyre, and he's part of UNSW Sydney's Biosecurity program. His research focuses on using artificial intelligence for public health threat detection. He's also an experienced clinical trials manager, public health and immunisation nurse with experience working for international non-government organisations. Before we go ahead with Damian's presentation, I'll introduce also Zubair. So Zubair Akhtar is also a PhD candidate with the Biosecurity program at the Kirby Institute and a research officer with EPIWATCH. Zubair's an infectious disease epidemiologist. He's, as I mentioned, a PhD candidate, and he's led impactful influenza and SARS-CoV-2 research across South Asia. His work as the national principal investigator on a multi-country influenza vaccine trial influenced global cardiovascular guidelines, and his PhD focuses on influenza and COVID-19 in cardiovascular patients in Australia and Bangladesh. So firstly, we'll hand over to Damian, and then I'll quickly reintroduce Zubair following Damian's presentation. So thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining today. Just checking you can see my screen there. Yeah, thank you. So good afternoon. My name is Damian Honeyman. I'm a PhD candidate at the Kirby and the Biosecurity program, as mentioned, supervised by David Heslop and Prof. Rana McIntyre. I'd also first like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging. So thank you for joining us today. So this is my current thesis title, Leveraging Large Language Models and Open Source Intelligence for Early Warning of Chemical, Biological, Nuclear, Radiological, Nuclear, and Explosive Threat Events. So just sort of a brief sort of snapshot today, speaking about these two aims, to systematically review the global history of CBRN threat events and to systematically analyse the global epi of botulism and intoxications using data from EPIWATCH, the open source intelligence system. So more broadly, this is my thesis outline, and I've picked, I have 3 systematic reviews in chapter 1, and the one I'll be speaking about today is biological warfare, major biological events through the ages, a systematic review from prehistoric times to the present, and in chapter 5, the global epi of botulism outbreaks from open source intel 2016 to 2025. So chapter 1, as I just previously announced, was authored by myself, Zubair, who's also in the call, David and Raina. So biological weapons encompass microorganisms such as viruses, bacteria, fungi, or their toxic products, which are deliberately produced and released to inflict disease, death in humans and animals or plants. And then biowarfare refers to the intentional use of these pathogens or toxins by nation states against enemy populations, livestock or crops. And bioterrorism involves illicit actors such as terrorist groups that deploy or threaten the release of these agents to induce fear, disruption, or political change. Many agents mimic chemical warfare in their ability to be aerosolized, drifting with the winds and infiltrating air-exposed areas. However, their viability and virulence are highly influenced by sunlight, temperature, terrain, making their battlefield outcomes unpredictable. So agents can be spread through parenteral inhalation, contact, or the oral fecal routes. And the weapons have key agent traits of lethality, stability, or ease of dissemination. An effective bioweapon must be highly pathogenic, able to replicate in the host, to remain stable during storage and dissemination, and require minimal technical expertise to deploy, or while producing rapid disease or death or psychological terror. The US CDC ranks these agents by spread, severity of illness, and potential for public health impact, as Cat A the highest, Cat B moderate, and Cat C emerging. So from prehistoric tactics, the methods of deploying such agents have grown in sophistication, yet bioterrorism and biological warfare events like chemical warfare are complex phenomena, often shrouded in secrecy, and their existence is questionable. So the aim of this project was to systematically review the global use of biological agents in both warfare and accidental events, integrating CDC category, agent identity, the distribution globally, the intent, whether deliberate or accidental, and the associated morbidity and mortality. For this review, we adhered to the PRISMA checklist to ensure transparent reporting. We conducted database searches using history, biological, and warfare, and secondary Google Scholar reviews to grad literature to capture events not indexed in any bibliographic databases. And then a domain expert, David Heslop, identified any key textbooks and seminal works. We also snowballed reference lists for included sources to maximize completeness. Inclusion required documented evidence of actual agent use, and 2 reviewers independently screened the titles, abstracts, and full texts. Any disagreements were resolved by consensus. So we extracted all the variables into a predefined spreadsheet, and a second author reviewed the entries. And then my 2 senior domain experts reviewed the discrepancies for the final validated data set. We performed all these statistical analyses on the data using Stata, and geospatial analysis using ArcGIS Pro. We began with 1,101 records across all databases and grad literature sources. After removing duplicates and applying our title, abstract, and full screening against the inclusion criteria, we've found 52 studies that remained for detailed analysis. Our review spans the full arc of known biological agent use, from prehistoric poison-tipped arrows through ancient and medieval tactics, the early modern period, so the 15th to 18th centuries, 19th century, and both the early and mid-20th century conflicts, culminating in late 20th century events. We documented 46 confirmed biological agent incidents. Of these, 43 were deliberate and whether state-sponsored or bioterrorist, and 3 were major accidental releases. Across all events, we conservatively recorded at least 60,587 injuries and 272 deaths. These figures likely underestimate the true burden, given historical reporting limitations and secrecy surrounding such events. When classified by the CDC biothreat category, Cat agents comprised 40.6% of the events, Cat B 27.5%, Cat C 24.6%, and then 7.2% of the events actually fell outside the CDC framework, meaning the agents couldn't fit into these categories. A total of 20 different microbial toxins or pathogens were implicated and deployed across 69 discrete events. An additional agent instance remains unidentified, but it was used in 2 occasions. Bacillus anthracis led deployments with 11 events, followed by Vibrio cholerae, 7 events, and variola virus, 6 events, underscoring their historical prominence. The dominant routes of release were contaminated food or beverage with 11 events, infected live animals, and equally fire-infected cadavers or mailed letters with 4 events, respectively. We identified 26 distinct perpetrators, and the top origin of these perpetrators in the countries respectively were the US, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. Not to say that the events were perpetrated by these countries, it's just the perpetrators originated from these countries. Events spanned 29 different countries, with the US accounting for the largest share, with the Soviet Union and Italy recording at least 3 events, respectively. Our review collates all publicly documented instances of biological agent deployment, from poison arrows in prehistoric times through state-sponsored biowarfare and modern bioterrorist plots, highlighting continuous evolution in methods and scale. And this shows that advanced biotechnology and even home labs or legitimate research facilities could produce these pathogens. and small covert releases risk infecting populations hours and days later, making biological weapons uniquely insidious. With tighter regulation and inspections, bioscience labs may deter open development of such threats, but they cannot fully prevent clandestine programs. Therefore, a multi-layered surveillance strategy, including international cooperation, is essential, and maintaining a global near real-time surveillance network is imperative. Timely reporting of suspected or confirmed incidents not only aids in outbreak containment, but also helps attribute responsibility, thus deterring future misuse. Next, I'll discuss my Chapter 5 project, which is the global epi of botulism outbreaks from OSINT 2016 to 2025, which was authored by myself, David, and Rona. So botulism is a serious, potentially fatal neuroparalytic illness caused primarily by Clostridium botulism toxins, specifically types A, B, E, and F, alongside rare cases of C. butyricum and C. barati. These toxins are among the most potent biological agents known. Botulism neurotoxin, or BONT, exerts its effect by cleaving snare proteins, thereby blocking frontal acetylcholine release at the peripheral cholinergic synapses. This results in profound transient flaccid paralysis. Without intervention, respiratory muscle paralysis follows, leading to high mortality rates. Under environmental stresses such as nutrient deprivation, which is low salt, low sugar, combined with anaerobic and basic PhD conditions, the toxin can, C. botulism can shift from its vegetative form into a spore. And these spores are highly resistant to heat and chemicals and can remain dormant yet viable for many years, complicating their eradication efforts. And there are 5 recognised clinical forms of botulism: food, wound, infant, iatrogenic, and adult intestinal toxemia. Among these, foodborne accounts for the majority of reported outbreaks worldwide. Each type carries unique risk factors and population demographics. Currently, botulism outbreaks are reported at national or state levels with no centralised global epidemiological reporting, and traditional systems rely on validated data from labs and healthcare providers, but many regions lack timely or publicly available data on botulism incidents. Open source intelligence, or OSINT, leverages publicly accessible information such as news reports, official websites, and social media to identify outbreaks in near real time. In the absence of comprehensive global reporting, OSINT can fill critical surveillance gaps by capturing signals of emerging botulism events. EPIWATCH is an AI-driven surveillance system that scours and passes multilingual OSINT data worldwide. It's been rigorously evaluated and validated for early epidemic warning. So here we aim to leverage data from EPIWATCH spanning the end of 2016 to the beginning of 2025 to describe the global epi of reported botulism outbreaks. And then we could also highlight any temporal or geographic patterns that the traditional systems might have missed. We first compiled botulism search terms based on CDC guidelines, using those already in the EPIWATCH system. Using these terms, we extracted all botulism-related reports. And then for our analysis, we defined an outbreak as per the CDC definition of at least 2 confirmed or probable cases presenting with clinical features indicative of botulism. We also included isolated and sporadic cases to capture the full scope of reported events globally. We included any OSINT-derived articles describing outbreaks in humans or animals that reported actual case numbers. We also captured outbreaks of cross-border spread to understand wider epidemiological patterns. We deliberately excluded routine monthly, quarterly, or annual surveillance bulletins because those represent formal public health rather than OSINT sources. We also excluded articles that lacked case counts, those focusing on non-botulism incidents such as product recalls without cases, or environmental samples without human or animal cases. We also excluded broken or paywalled URLs in our dataset and any legal or media awareness pieces unrelated to outbreaks. We removed outbreaks that were duplicate and inaccessible, and then extracted all our data into a predefined spreadsheet for our analysis. And then at the end, to ensure accuracy, we randomly rechecked 100 of these articles to confirm consistency in data capture. To avoid double counting, we treated articles referencing the same event with identical case numbers, symptoms, source, origin, location within the 30-day window as the same outbreak. We computed the global frequency of reported outbreaks and calculated the incident rates per 1 million population. And then to explore the socioeconomic associations, we categorize countries by World Bank income groups as high income, upper middle income, and lower middle income, and perform tests comparing the incidence of outbreaks between these groups. And finally, for human outbreaks for which exposure to onset data were available, we plotted the distribution on time intervals. And then finally, we used ArcGIS to generate maps to display the geographic distribution of both human and animal outbreaks, to identify regional hotspots and illustrate the global reach of botulism events across the study period. So between the 31st of December 2016 and the 1st of January 2025, we found 1,202 articles, 1,112 were human and 90 were animal. And after our cutting these down, we found 296 unique outbreaks, 259 were human and 37 were animal. And we conservatively recorded 28,634 cases and almost just as many deaths. Humans accounted for only 3.8% of the cases and 0.2% of the deaths, and we can see the majority of these were in animal populations. So the outbreaks occurred across 36 countries, with 29 countries having human outbreaks. Of these outbreaks in humans, they most frequently occurred in Ukraine, the Russian Federation, and the US. And we can also see the same results here, but the addition of animal outbreaks with the US, France, the Netherlands, India, and Italy having outbreaks. And 37 of these outbreaks occurred across 15 different countries for the animal outbreaks. And here's just a global hotspot map sort of showing that same data as well. Among 100 outbreaks that reported symptoms, we had 46 different symptoms that were identified, with the total cumulative number of time symptoms reported being 400 across these outbreaks. And most frequently, symptoms were dysphagia, nausea, and generalized weakness. Among outbreaks reporting on hospitalization and receiving antitoxin, human outbreaks, we identified 80 that were admitted to a general hospital. 60 stated cases were admitted to a general hospital and received antitoxin, and 22 were admitted to ICU and received antitoxin. Almost half of the human outbreaks reported cases in people over the age of 18, while 40.9% of these articles did not state ages across the outbreaks. Across outbreaks, gender was not stated in 36.7% of the outbreaks, whereas males accounted for 29.7%, females 22.4%, and mixed sex outbreaks accounted for 11.2%. Of the 259 human outbreaks, a source was identified in 84.6% of these, and the three most common sources were dried fish, unknown sources, and canned fish. When categorized, fish accounted for 38.6% of these outbreaks, meats 19.7%, and unknown were 16.6%, with the most common categories. And outbreaks are most frequently homemade or from unknown sources and from supermarkets. Botulism outbreaks are most commonly foodborne, unknown, or iatrogenic. Toxin strain was infrequently identified across outbreaks. Strain B accounted for 1.2%, strain E 0.8%, and strain A 0.4%. It's quite minimal. The time between exposure and symptom onset was also infrequently reported in the OSINT articles. However, when reported, the two most common were 1 day and the same day. For animals, outbreaks were most frequently affected birds, cattle, and horses when reported, and the source of these outbreaks was rarely reported. But if they were caused by contaminated hay from a local farm, contaminated water in parks, and alfalfa cubes from feed stores. The 28 outbreaks of botulism that were identified in the Russian Federation occurred across 18 regions, including 4 republics, 13 oblasts, and 1 krai. And the source of these outbreaks are most commonly dried fish, homemade, and therefore most outbreaks were foodborne. The 146 outbreaks of botulism identified in Ukraine occurred across 24 of the country's 27 first-order administrative divisions. And the source of these outbreaks are most commonly dried fish, homemade, and therefore most commonly foodborne. And here in this map, we can see in the shaded areas the number of attacks by Russian forces since the invasion began. with the red area representing the highest number of attacks and the dark circles representing the number of outbreaks. We aimed to examine if outbreaks had occurred in areas with higher numbers of outbreaks, but we couldn't conclude this. So, in conclusion, between the study period of 2016 to 2025, botulism outbreaks continually surfaced worldwide. Notably, the period 2022 to 2024 showed an uptick in reported events, underlying concerning trend in global incidents. Our findings confirm that OSINT, specifically through EPIWATCH platform, can reliably detect isolated cases and larger outbreaks. This approach is particularly valuable in regions lacking robust formal disease reporting systems. We saw diverse contexts where EPIWATCH flagged significant outbreaks, where of foodborne cases in the US, despite strict food and safety regulations, though there may have been a bias in the detection due to the US having better surveillance and local reporting. And in the Ukraine, where traditional home canning may have facilitated toxin growth. Additionally, iatrogenic botulism emerged in Turkey under less strict, less regulated clinical settings, and a separate US outbreak was traced to counterfeit botulism products. Conflict zones like the Russian Federation and Ukraine exhibited a disproportionately high number of foodborne botulism events. In Ukraine's case, many outbreaks correlated with a mass fish die-off in reservoirs due to an ecological fallout from the Kharkov dam destruction in June 2023, underscoring how warfare can indirectly exacerbate public health threats. Among human outbreaks, dysphagia remained the most frequently reported clinical feature, consistent with earlier literature. When age data were available, at least half of the cases involved those over 18, but there was no clear sex dominance, highlighting that botulism risk spans across all demographic groups and age groups. Using OSINT lets us capture early warning signals of these events, especially in conflict zones when formal surveillance may collapse. By capturing media reports, social media, and local news, EPIWATCH can detect outbreaks that might be missed or delayed by official channels. But while OSINT can act as a frontline alert, helping neighbouring regions prepare for cross-border contamination and spread, it's not intended to replace established surveillance systems. Instead, it serves as a complementary source, flagging hotspots and enabling public health responses when traditional surveillance systems lag. In summary, our study demonstrates EPIWATCH is feasible and is a global tool for botulism surveillance. To conclude these two projects collectively, they support my overarching aims of my research by providing critical insights into biological threat detection and surveillance. The first project systematically reviewed all publicly documented instances of biological agent use throughout history, demonstrating the increasing frequency and growing sophistication of such attacks. The second project analysed the global botulism events during the study period, offering a detailed account of outbreaks ranging from isolated incidents like homemade food, often resulting in family fatalities, to large-scale iatrogenic intoxications involving counterfeit botulism toxin in both regulated and unregulated clinical settings. Together, these findings underscore the urgent need for globally coordinated surveillance systems capable of detecting and tracking high-risk biological threats. Such systems must be prioritised within public health to effectively reduce morbidity and mortality. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Damian, for a very enlightening presentation. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions as we move into our Q&A session at the end. At this time, I'd like to then move over to Zubair Akhtar's presentation. So Zubair, I'll hand over to you and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining today. My name is Zubair Akhtar, and I'm also a PhD candidate at the Biosecurity program. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the Bedigo people of the Euro Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present. I am supervised by Professor Rainer McIntyre, Professor Olaf Robert, Professor Tim Tan, and Dr. Aymor from our BSP program. My topic today is protecting the heart, the role of influenza and COVID vaccines. In the next 20 minutes, I will present part of my PhD, highlighting my objectives, which are through a series of studies and on influenza and COVID vaccine. And I will share my findings and as well as my overall conclusion from my thesis work. So to give a background, an estimated 20.5 million annual cardiovascular deaths occur globally. And on the infectious part, the influenza and COVID-19 have similar clinical manifestations like fever, cough, sore throat, and runny nose. And both these viruses are known risk factors for cardiovascular diseases. So before we move on, let's have a look at the mechanism of a heart attack. We call it acute myocardial infarction. So the top one is a normal artery where the lumen is patent and blood can move freely. And in the partial block, the middle one, you can see a little yellow patch, which is a fat deposit. This is clinically atherosclerosis in medical terms. And these are fat deposits along the wall, which makes the lumen narrower, preventing free blood flow. And when this is too much, this causes a complete block, and that leads to diminished supply to your heart. And that's where the myocardial infarction takes place, or the heart attack takes place. So when this happens, you get a chest pain, and they call it a Hollywood style heart attack. Hollywood style in the sense that this is how it is shown in movies and television, but in reality, the symptoms can be subtle. It can be just chest and abdominal discomfort, and you may have profuse sweating and also difficulty in breathing. So this can also lead to a heart attack. So once you have that, in the next 20 minutes, if you can reach a medical facility with all the facilities available, then what they will do angioplasty or PCI or stenting, whichever one you call. So what they're going to put in a catheter inside you through your veins in arteries in arms or legs, and put a stent over there to keep the blood flow through a patent artery in your heart. And that's a minimally invasive treatment, and you can get back to your normal life soon after. So let's look at the mechanism by which an acute myocardial infarction or a heart attack may be triggered. On the right-hand side, you can see that there is it can happen by an indirect damage by viral infection, which can be either COVID or influenza. They pretty much have a similar mechanism that leads to a cascade of immune response in the body, and that leads to a heart attack. On the left-hand side, which is a bit unique for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it directly affects your heart muscles and causes arrhythmia, and that leads to a heart failure. And these all lead to a very acute condition known as the acute myocardial infarction. So this is extracted from a review paper that was my first PhD paper published in the European Heart Journal. So my overall objectives for the thesis was firstly to investigate the optimal timing of influenza vaccination for post-cardiovascular event patients, and also the effectiveness of a vaccine in reducing cardiovascular disease incidence. Those are my chapter 1 and 2. And also I have a COVID component where I characterize the recurrent cardiovascular events during a COVID-19 pandemic and evaluated the effectiveness of vaccination in their prevention. These are chapter 3 and 4. In the interest of time, I'll go for chapter 1 and 2 for this presentation today. So this was the second paper from my PhD. It was a post hoc analysis of the IME trial. I'll describe IME trial soon. We wanted to see the optimal timing of influenza vaccination among patients who just had a heart attack. So what was the IME trial? It was the largest clinical trial on influenza vaccine, looking at improving outcomes in patients with acute myocardial infarction. So we tried to answer the question, can influenza vaccination improve outcomes in patients with recent TMI? And yes, the answer was it significantly lowered the risk. And yes, and that led to change in the guidelines for acute coronary syndrome management by the European Society of Cardiologists and the American College of Cardiologists and American Heart Association guidelines. So everybody gets a flu shot or influenza vaccine if they come with a heart attack and if they have not been vaccinated for that season. And the level of evidence for this information has been upgraded to class 1A from class 1B. So it's the highest level of evidence that's available that led to these guideline changes. So for my study, the background and aim was to the background regarding the timing was that vaccination during an influenza season is not established because there are concerns of waning of antibodies, and that may reduce the vaccine effectiveness. And it is also hard to find a proper time because influenza season usually doesn't stay within limits. It extends beyond seasons. So the aim was to investigate influenza vaccine effectiveness following early or late vaccination in a post-hoc analysis of the IMI trial. So the methods, it was a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trial across 30 centers of 8 countries, including Australia and Bangladesh. 2,571 patients were randomized, and more than 98% of those were included in this analysis. It was conducted from the 1st of October of 2016 to the 1st of March 2020, just before the COVID pandemic was declared. Patients were recruited from September to March for the European countries and from May to September for Australia and Bangladesh, who shared the common influenza seasonality, respective seasonality at the same time, despite being in different hemispheres. For data analysis, we considered early vaccination as September to November for the Northern Hemisphere, which are the European countries, and May to July for Southern Hemisphere, which is for Australia and Bangladesh. And we were interested in 3 particular endpoints, the first being a primary composite endpoint of another AMI or acute myocardial infarction, or the stent that we put in treatment of that AMI, if that is again occluded. So this was a composite endpoint. And the secondary endpoints was all-cause death and cardiovascular death. So these were the endpoints we were interested in. We did Cox proportional hazard model to determine the early and late interaction terms. Then we used the Kaplan-Meier survival estimates to determine the cumulative incidences of endpoints at 12-month post-randomization and early versus late. This was done for both occasions. We then used the Kaplan-Meier survival estimates to determine the absolute risk difference and 95% confidence interval at 12 months. So to describe the countries, Australia, Bangladesh, Sweden, Bangladesh, and Denmark contributed most of the patients, and it was mostly the Northern Hemisphere who contributed to this vaccine trial. If we go for hemisphere, it was like 65-35, 65% being Northern and 35% being the Southern Hemisphere patients. If we consider season, we are considering season because the European countries have season span across 2 years. So for 2016, it gradually increased, and in 2019-20, most of the patients were recruited. For the baseline characteristics, equal number of vaccination and placebo recipients were there. And one thing to highlight is that in most cardiovascular studies, it's massively skewed towards male. And in our case, it was almost 82%. So these are where our interesting results come. For the primary composite endpoints, we have the stent new AMI or a stent thrombosis, the Kaplan-Meier event curves of the influenza vaccine and placebo groups in patients vaccinated early are the left panels, and the right panels are the ones for the late vaccination for the primary composite endpoints. And you can see the hazard ratios for all of them. And the hazard ratio below 1 suggests more protective attributes towards early vaccination. And when it comes to the risk difference, you can see the cumulative incidences is more for the placebo and less for the vaccine. That means that vaccine is more effective. And the risk difference in between the two in the early vaccination group is much higher than the late vaccination, which also indicates that it favors earlier vaccination. If we go to the next endpoint, which was all-cause death, we see similar results, lower hazard ratios, and the risk difference in this case was also similar, but more higher for the, the risk difference was higher for the early compared to the late one. This also favors the early vaccination. This is my conclusion for the overall study. My influenza, there was an observed risk difference which favored early vaccination, and without consideration of timing, everyone should be vaccinated. And as per guideline changes, it is strongly recommended. The only downside, my findings were statistically not significant. So this is the only drawback of this study, but everything else seems to be favoring the early vaccination. So moving on to the next chapter, the next chapter was prevention of cardiovascular diseases with standard dose quadrivalent influenza vaccine in people aged 50 and above in Australia during the 2017 AH3N2 epidemic. This recently got published, and the background was that the influenza season in 2017 was very intense, with only 10% effectiveness of the vaccine against the H3N2, whereas it was overall 33% effective versus infection all across the other strains and subgroups. And it was the last year of exclusive use of standard dose of quadrivalent influenza vaccine for all age groups. As from 2018, Australia's NIP introduced enhanced vaccines, which included adjuvanted and high-dose formulations for 65 and above years. And this gives us a unique opportunity to study the vaccine effectiveness of this vaccine. And our aim was to estimate the vaccine effectiveness among people above 50 in Australia during 2017. For methods, this was within the New South Wales 45 and up cohort study, and this was conducted between May to September of 2017, which is the Australian influenza season. The design was a nested case control design within the 45 and up study. Cases were cardiovascular admissions and controls were gastrointestinal admissions. We performed descriptive analysis and did logistic regression to find out the odds for risk factors of hospitalization as either a case or a control. We also did some sensitivity analysis for propensity score matching and residual confounding evaluation. So these were all the databases that we have used and how we selected our participants. We first linked the 45 and up cohort with the admitted patients' data and the pharma benefit schedules, and then finally with the Australian Immunization Register to get 10,445 eligible participants. We then matched them based on age group and sex and retained 85% of those participants, having 4,452 controls and cases on each arm. So participants were equally balanced across age groups and sex. The higher rate of cardiovascular admission among cases was expected, but what was unfortunate, however, was their significantly lower vaccination uptake compared to controls. For the logistic regression to identify risk factors in the univariate logistic regression, the odds of flu vaccination was 0.32, suggestive of a protective association. And in the multivariate one, after adjusting for BMI, overweight, BMI, smoking, and income, the adjusted odds ratio was 0.15, which is also suggestive of a protective association. Subsequently, we plugged this adjusted odds ratio into the formula to estimate the vaccine effectiveness. So in conclusion, the vaccine effectiveness was 85% in preventing a cardiovascular hospitalization. So it was associated with reducing complications of influenza, even if not reducing the infection. And if we vaccinate people in a larger scale, it may help in mitigating the cardiovascular disease burden. And these findings came at a time when the vaccination against the infection was pretty low. Now I move on to the third chapter, I will just say what they are. This is under a second round of review in Health Science Report, where I looked at the incidence of recurrent cardiovascular events among patients with acute myocardial infarctions during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in Bangladesh. It was an observational study. So the key highlight of this study was that there were more incidences of recurrent cardiovascular events compared to pre-pandemic period in the same setting. And then we looked at the COVID-19 vaccination and mortality in coronary care unit patients with severe acute respiratory infections. This is a prospective study in Bangladesh from 2022-2024. We are looking at the vaccine effectiveness, and initial results show that the COVID-19 vaccine is also protective of preventing all-cause mortality. So to sum up, I would like to get back to my PhD research question, but before I do, I would like to highlight one thing. In a recent study by Monash University researchers who looked into the attitudes and beliefs of Australian cardiologists on the role of seasonal influenza immunization in cardiovascular care, they found that only 1 in 4 cardiologists recommend influenza vaccine in Australia. So that's this is something we would like to change. We would want all cardiologists to recommend influenza vaccine. So my research question was, can vaccines protect the against COVID and influenza, in turn protecting the heart? So my answer is this: yes, both influenza and COVID vaccine can decrease the morbidity, is associated with decreasing morbidity. It's also associated in decreasing the mortality, and early vaccination favors for a better protection. This is in the landscape that the COVID vaccine and the COVID pandemic escalated cardiovascular events in the world, but for the COVID component, future research work is still needed to have more scientifically robust conclusion. That's all from me. Just to acknowledge all the participating patients, institutions, my trial study donors, UNSW for the scholarship, my amazing panel of supervisors, Digirigora Yanu. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Clap to both of you and from all of us. It was very enjoyable presentations, I have to say. We don't have any current questions in the chat, so I would firstly like to encourage everyone to participate in the Q&A. I think we've got actually one from Aya, I think it is. And so that question is to Zubair. So we might start with you, and I've got a question for you too, Zubair, after. So Zubair, do you have any thoughts of why the rate of flu vaccine recommendation among cardiologists is so low?
Yes, because there are recent evidences that influenza and COVID, COVID just came up, but influenza is associated with, as a risk factor for cardiovascular diseases. And the trial results have been published in the middle of pandemic 2021, where much of the attention and focus was probably towards the COVID-19 pandemic. But this is fairly a new thing, and that is why most probably cardiologists don't adopt this at the point. But having the guidelines being changed, and in the major conferences, this is much talked topic nowadays. So maybe a few years down the line, there's gonna be a change. And from a personal point of view, yes, influenza vaccines do prevent infection, and as added benefit, you get to protect your heart. So this is a win-win situation. So if you have a choice of going for a vaccination, everyone should adopt that. Thank you.
Thank you. And my question, I guess, does flow on quite well from this. So the question really comes down to, I guess, the bad reputation that came from COVID vaccinations in relation to cardiovascular events, and the time, let's just say the time course for both. And the question relates to this. if COVID-related cardiovascular complications occurred quite quickly, however, the protective benefit of COVID vaccinations actually is spread over a longer period of time. Is there potentially just a misconception within the medical community that, in fact, whilst there might be some people who get cardiovascular effects early due to myocarditis, for example, from the mRNA vaccines, actually overall for the whole population, you have a significant protective effect against other cardiovascular disease? Is that sort of the message sort of that you would send about COVID vaccines?
Yep, we discussed this in the review paper, and the myocarditis that the influenza vaccine causes is mostly towards the young adults. And if you judge it from a risk and benefit ratio, the benefits are much higher than the risks involved. Yeah, that was our final message. And yes, you're right. The long-term and overall benefits outweigh the risk that the vaccine poses.
And I guess it's early days, but a question about influenza vaccines. Given that we have seasonal influenza vaccines, does the cardiovascular protection effect persist in subsequent seasons, essentially, from preceding vaccines?
Yes, because influenza vaccine has shown that, and it's something, I mean, the vaccine should be taken annually at this, I mean, before the season or early into the season. So that keeps all the, the mechanism that I showed regarding the immune response, that probably affects that part. So every year it should keep. And if you are in an understanding that I've taken flu vaccine once, and that should give me a lifetime or a significantly long protection, I think that's not ideal. So every year it should be renewed.
Yeah, so you get the maximum benefit from the current season's vaccine.
Yep.
Okay, understood. Yep. Thank you. That's clear. All right. Well, then I don't think we've got any Q&A. Oh, here we do. We're from Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. Very timely. So the question is for Damian. So Damian, if 49.4% of botulism outbreaks are attributed to homemade products, nearly triple supermarket sourced outbreaks, why emphasize formal market structures when non-commercial food preparation seems to dominate comparative risk profiles?
Yeah, so I think from this, like the data shows that, sources for outbreaks really don't discriminate if they're from supermarkets or from homemade sources. And some people are actually canning their own foods at home, and that's leading to that spore sort of transformation and making them unwell. I think comparatively, like the risk is associated with food, homemade as well as from supermarket sources, and it's not discriminatory in that effect. It's certain countries where it's more prevalent, such as I showed in the Ukraine or the Russian Federation, where certain supermarkets or maybe not so legal supermarkets are producing their own versions of products where the risk profile might be heightened. Unfortunately, that was shown in sort of the Eastern European region. I hope I've answered that correctly.
Yes, I think you have actually. Jeff, you might have any follow-up questions about this, please feel free to pop them in and we can ask them again if you didn't address that, but I think it did. And so I guess my question to you, Damian, sort of really comes more broadly, this idea of if Bont is so toxic and relatively easy to make a mistake and poison yourself with, why haven't we seen it more often used in deliberate events, do you think? Is it a question that we might have, that these might be sort of unattributed cases that are out there that were deliberate and perhaps were not recognised, or is it just other reasons?
Yeah, I think, when the Japanese sect tried to disseminate botulism toxin in the 90s, they had a failed attempt due to the inability for their mode of dispersal. So I think in general, we could say that the aerosolization of the neurotoxin is quite difficult for some. I think it's certainly possible for sects or groups to do dispersal. And in second to that, I think maybe the medical, fraternity is probably not looking at botulism as a first indication for illness. So that sort of diagnosis is probably not first thought when people are presenting with similar illnesses, acute gastroenteritis or food poisoning associated events. So yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. We'll head back to Zubair. John's asked the question, more of a point of clarification, I guess, Zubair. If read correctly, both vaccine and placebo late groups had similar cumulative incidences of CVD events. I think this is the Kaplan-Meier graphs, but were similar to the vaccine early group. So only the placebo early group was elevated. Is that right?
This is partly right, but a more concrete way of describing that is they are in comparison to the placebo and the vaccine. The comparison is between those, not between the early or late. The point that makes the difference is the risk difference between an early and late. So that's where it's difference. But if you place both the graphs side by side, it's not the cumulative incidences of vaccine or placebo that affects. John, if I have answered your question correctly, or I can follow up this with you with the graphs in place. And for the second part about the confounder, there could be many, but possibly because of waning antibodies or the severities of the season could also play an effect. And for cardiac patients, they respond differently to treatments, the same guideline recommended treatments. So there could be that. So these are possible confounders. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I do have one other question, I guess, for this one's for Damian. And so the question I have was related to attribution. So when it comes to deliberate biological events, attribution is a major issue. So was this deliberate? Was it not? Who did it? Who didn't do it? Do we know or not? And I guess the question is, using AI, does this open doors for us to perhaps more easily attribute or, I guess, red flag events that have unusual characteristics? What do you think?
Oh, thanks. That's a great question, actually. So yeah, I guess with the advent of AI and large language models, we can develop pathways to formally analyze outbreaks and look at key indicators to determine if there is a threat profile that we can create from that. And we can attribute that to, say, nefarious characters in society. And I think that's the way things are going with AI. We can look through data to look for those characteristics. So I think that's a really good area of research that we could follow up in the future.
Well, thank you. And so EPIWATCH, you're saying EPIWATCH is sort of an effective first step in that pathway, yes?
The gathering of the data through EPIWATCH, passing all that multilingual data from various sources and all across the world provides that sort of first step to show the event. And then if we take a deeper dive using, large language models and some prompt engineering, we can actually find out those characteristics, David. And I think, EPIWATCH is doing a fantastic job at that.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions for our excellent presenters today? Well, I might, in that case, give everyone a little bit of time back into their day. Last call on any questions. If not, please reach out directly to both Damian and also Zubair by email if you have any points of clarification or questions. I'd just like to finally thank our administrative team, Samantha and Rata, for organising this event. And then secondly, to Damian and Zubair for two excellent presentations, very enlightening and really highlighting the high quality of research that is being conducted at the Biosecurity program. So well done, and a pleasure to be here. I'm sure everyone got a lot out of this. Jeff does have a question before we head off, though. How does EPIWATCH penetrate these nefarious sources if it relies on open media or at least partially open state, open media? It is a good question, Damian. I've got my views on that, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's an interesting one as well. I don't know how they'll sort of penetrate the nefarious sources. I think it's sort of developing those characteristics and that threat profile through the open source media. Then I guess it's a way of attributing the blame, so to speak, but you can't. I think it's a very cautious field. Yeah. I'll hand over to you, David. You might be able to add some more to that one.
Look, all I'd say is that there's been that the area of grey zone warfare, for example, and thinking back even as an historical example, like Sun Tzu's commentary on the principles of warfare does highlight that if you undertake actions which are completely invisible to an enemy, then you won't be able to defend against that. And essentially that is correct. So if a nefarious actor completely hides every aspect of their planning, preparation, and then execution of their activity, that's not going to show up in open source media. But experience and history does show that that's actually not what happens. There's spillage of data consistently into open source. It might present as unusual cases that are presenting to hospitals. It might present as increased demand during an early outbreak within a community. It might present as chatter within social media. It might present as unusual sequences of events or associations of sort of quite disparate data together. And that's the idea of sort of using these AI tools to cross-correlate and identify those sort of appropriately trained and vetted and overseen. But that's the general idea, and that's very similar to other forms of intelligence gathering that's used in other fields. So sort of that's sort of my take on that, Jeff. Sort of how EPIWATCH can be useful, but it must be overseen by a human interpreter. Otherwise, garbage in can be garbage out, and I think that principle still applies very strongly. Yep. Okay, well, we'll leave it there, everybody. Lovely to see you all, and thank you for joining us for the presentations. It means a lot to the candidates. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.